My name is Simon Reeve and I am 42 years old. 2 months ago, a man named Wade Garrett walked into the back room of the Ashwood Grange Hall expecting to meet a wealthy widow he intended to rob. And instead, he walked into a room holding 14 people he had already robbed, sitting in folding chairs waiting for him, with 2 state investigators standing by the door. I was in the second row. I watched Wade Garrett's face come through that doorway, wearing the easy sunlit smile I knew so well, the smile that had once made me trust him with everything I had. And I watched that smile die in real time as his eyes moved across the room, chair by chair, recognizing face after face after face, all the people he thought were scattered and silent and too ashamed to ever compare notes. He had spent his whole life counting on the fact that his victims never talked to each other, and there we all were, in one room, talking. For 8 months, Wade Garrett had done to me what he had done to strangers in a dozen towns before mine. He came in charming. He made himself indispensable. He found the exact soft place in my life, and he took $110,000 from me, most of it money my father had left when he died. Money that represented 40 years of an honest man's work. Then he vanished, the way he always vanished, certain that I would do what all his victims did, which was sit alone with my shame and never say a word. But here is the one thing Wade Garrett did not understand about the town he picked, or about me. He built his whole life on the belief that shame keeps people quiet, and quiet keeps people apart. He was right about the shame. He was wrong about the quiet, because the day I stopped being ashamed was the day I started making phone calls, and once I started making phone calls, Wade Garrett was already finished. He just did not know it yet. He would not know it until he walked through that door at the Grange Hall. Before we get into this, if you are new here, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. And while you are here, do me a favor and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every one of them, and I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the town my father built his name in, and the shop where I have spent my whole life with grease under my fingernails. I grew up in Ashwood, a town of about 7,000 people in the valley where the state highway bends around the reservoir. 1 traffic light, though we have 2 now, which the old-timers still complain about. My father, Earl Reeve, opened Reeve Auto on Main Street the year before I was born, and he ran it for 38 years. And in all that time he built something rarer than money, though I did not fully understand its value until Wade Garrett tried to take it. My father built trust. In a town like Ashwood, Earl Reeve's word was a currency. If Earl told you your transmission was going, your transmission was going, and if Earl told you it would hold another year, you drove another year without a worry, because Earl Reeve did not lie to people about their cars, not to make a sale, not ever. Farmers brought him their trucks. The county brought him their vehicles. 3 generations of families brought him every car they ever owned, because a man who tells you the truth about your brakes is a man you trust with your life, whether you think about it that way or not. I saw what that trust was worth exactly once while my father was alive, and I have never forgotten it. A woman came in one winter, a school teacher on a tight budget, convinced by a chain shop in the city that she needed a full brake job. Rotors and all, $600 she did not have. My father put the car up, looked at it for 10 minutes, brought her into the bay, and showed her that her brakes had a year of life left, easy. He charged her nothing for the look. She cried a little, right there in the garage, out of relief, and she told everyone she knew, and for the next 20 years that woman and everyone she loved brought their cars to Reeve Auto and no one else. My father did not do it as a strategy. He did it because it was true, and the truth was simply how he operated. But I learned, watching that honesty is not only right, it is the most durable thing a man can build, more durable than money, because money can be stolen in an afternoon. And a name like Earl Reeves takes a lifetime to earn, and cannot be taken at all. Cannot be taken. Wade Garrett, it turned out, could take my father's money. He could never touch my father's name. And in the end, that name is exactly what beat him. I started sweeping the floor of that shop when I was 9. I did my first oil change at 12, standing on an upturned milk crate. I never wanted to do anything else, and I never had to, because my father raised me into the work the way you raise a boy into a family business, slowly, by letting him ruin a few things and fix a few more. I went to the community college for the automotive program, came home and worked beside my father for 18 years until his heart gave out one October, quietly, in the chair by the wood stove, the best man I have ever known. He left me the shop, free and clear, and a life insurance policy and some savings that together came to just over $130,000. That money was not just money to me. It was my father's whole careful life, distilled into a number, and I promised myself I would be worthy of it. I have thought a great deal since about how a man can keep a promise like that and still get robbed. I have decided that the answer is that being honest yourself makes you slow to see dishonesty in others. My father's greatest gift to me, his trust in people, was also the exact crack that Wade Garrett slipped through. I married Laura, who teaches 3rd grade at the Ashwood Elementary School, when I was 29. We have one boy, Danny, who is 10 and already asking to sweep the floor of the shop, and one on the way, a girl, due in the spring. We are not rich people. We live in a modest house 2 streets off Main with a mortgage and a minivan and the ordinary worries of ordinary people. My father's $130,000 sat in a savings account, and Laura and I used to talk about it late at night, carefully, the way you talk about the one real cushion you have. Maybe we would expand the shop. Maybe we would put it toward the kids someday. Maybe we would just leave it be, my father's steady hand still resting under our lives. What we never once imagined was that a stranger would talk us out of most of it inside a single year, with a smile and a story and a firm, warm handshake that reminded me, God help me, of my father's. Wade Garrett came to Ashwood in the spring, a little over a year ago. He was maybe 50, silver at the temples, fit, well-dressed but not flashy, the kind of man who wears an expensive watch like he has forgotten it is expensive. He told people he was a developer and investor who had done well in the cities and was looking for a quieter life, a place to slow down and do a few good projects and give back to a real community. He rented the big house out on Reservoir Road, the old Halloran place, and he paid a year up front in cash, which people noticed and repeated. He joined the Rotary. He wrote a check to the volunteer fire department that got read aloud at a meeting. He bought a classic Mustang, a beautiful 67 fastback that needed work, and he brought it to my shop. And that is how Wade Garrett walked into my life. Through the front door of Reeve Auto with the keys to a car, I fell in love with the moment I saw it. I want to be honest about how good he was, because if I make him sound obvious, then I am lying to you, and worse, I am letting you believe it could not happen to you, it could happen to you. Wade Garrett was the most likable man I ever met. He remembered everything, your kids' names, the thing you mentioned last week, the score of your boys' ball game. He was generous in small, genuine-seeming ways, always grabbing the check, always the first to help load somebody's truck. And he was interested, truly interested, or so it seemed, in me and my shop and my father. He would sit on the stool in the corner of the garage while I worked on the Mustang and ask about Earl, about how the business worked, about the town. And he listened like every word mattered. For a man who had lost his father and spent his days with people who mostly just wanted their cars fixed, that attention was its own kind of drug, and I did not even know I was thirsty for it until Wade Garrett came along and poured. The friendship came first, and that is the part people who have never been through it do not understand. The money was never the opening move. The opening move was months of real friendship, or what felt exactly like real friendship. Dinners at his place with Laura and me, him and his girlfriend, who I now know was likely part of it. Cookouts, a fishing trip up to the reservoir, where he told me, with tears in his eyes, about a son he had lost. A story I now suspect he has told in a dozen towns. Let me give you one scene from those months, because it is the scene I keep coming back to, the one that still has a hook in me. My boy Danny had a baseball game late that summer, a nothing game, a Tuesday evening in a dusty field with a dozen parents in lawn chairs. I did not expect anyone to come but Laura and me. Wade came. He showed up on his own in a ball cap with a bag of sunflower seeds, and he sat on the bleachers and cheered for my son by name, and when Danny got a hit, Wade Garrett was on his feet yelling louder than I was. Afterward, he crouched down to Danny's level and told him he had a beautiful swing and asked him serious questions about it, man to man, and my 10-year-old walked to the car 10 feet tall. On the drive home, Danny said, "Dad, I really like your friend Wade." And I remember feeling in that moment a warmth so complete that I would have trusted that man with anything. That is what I mean when I say the money was never the opening move. He spent an entire summer becoming the kind of man my son looked up to and my wife set a place for. And he did it, I now understand, with the patience of a professional, because that warmth was the product he was building. And the whole time he was measuring the exact size of what I had to lose. By the time Wade Garrett ever mentioned money to me, he was not a stranger with a pitch. He was my friend Wade, who I would have defended to anyone, who had sat at my table and held my son on his shoulders and cried about his own dead boy by the water. That is how the con works. They do not sell you an investment. They sell you a friendship, and the investment is just something you do for a friend. The pitch, when it finally came, did not even feel like a pitch. That was its genius. Wade had been talking for weeks about a development he was putting together, a small commercial project, a strip of storefronts, and a little professional building on a piece of land near the new highway interchange 2 towns over. He was not asking me for anything. He was just talking about it, excited, the way a friend talks about his work. And then one evening, almost reluctantly, he said that he had room for 1 or 2 local partners, people he trusted because he wanted the project to have real community roots and not just his city money. He said he had thought of me because I was the most honest man in Ashwood, my father's son, and he wanted honest partners. He showed me documents, real-looking documents, projections, a glossy site plan, a partnership agreement on the letterhead of a company that, I would learn, existed only as a name. He was not pushy. When I hesitated, he backed off completely, told me to forget he mentioned it, said the last thing he wanted was to mix money and friendship, which of course made me want in. That is a technique. I know that now. Pull it away, and the mark reaches for it. I did not decide in a night. I want you to know I was not reckless. I looked at the documents, I looked at them for weeks. But here is the thing, and it is the thing that still makes me sick. I looked at them the way an honest man looks at documents, which is to say I looked at whether they made sense, not at whether they were true. It never occurred to me deep down that my friend Wade would simply make them up, because it would never in 1,000 years occur to me to make them up myself. I measured him with my father's ruler, and my father's ruler could not measure a thing like Wade Garrett. Laura had a hesitation, a small one, the kind she could not put into words, and I talked her out of it, and I will carry that. I moved $110,000 of my father's money, most of what he left me, into what I believed was a partnership in a real development. Wade shook my hand across my own kitchen table, that warm, firm handshake, and he looked me in the eye and said, "Your dad would be proud of this, Simon." He used my father to close me. I have had to forgive myself for how much that worked. For a couple of months, everything was fine, which is part of it too. There were updates. There were a few photographs of a graded lot that could have been anywhere. Wade was around, same as always, the friendship uninterrupted, and every time I saw him, my worry, which I did not even fully admit I had, went quiet. And then, in the early fall, around the anniversary of my father's death, which I have always found a bitter piece of timing, Wade Garrett was simply gone. The house on Reservoir Road was empty, cleaned out over what must have been a single quiet weekend. His phone went to a message that then stopped working entirely. The company on the partnership agreement had no office, no listing, nothing. The land near the interchange, when I drove out to it in a panic, was owned by a farmer who had never heard of Wade Garrett and had never had one conversation about selling. There was no development. There was never any development. There was a graded corner of somebody's field that Wade had photographed to keep me calm. $110,000 of my father's life was gone, and so was my friend, and I understood, standing in that field, that the two had never been separate things at all. I'm going to tell you about the next few weeks, honestly, because these stories always skip the shame, and the shame is the whole engine of this kind of crime, and if I skip it, I am helping the next Wade Garrett. I did not tell anyone at first. Not Laura, not for 3 days, which is the worst thing I have ever done, and which I have apologized for 100 times. I was too ashamed. Me, Earl Reeves' son, the man the whole town trusts to tell the truth about their cars, had been played like a child, had handed my father's legacy to a smiling stranger, had talked my own wife out of her instincts to do it. The shame was so total that it made me want to disappear, to eat it, to never speak of it, to somehow earn the money back quietly and pretend it never happened. And I want you to hear this clearly because it is the most important thing in this entire story. That shame, that exact instinct to stay silent, is not an accident. It is the product. It is what Wade Garrett actually manufactures. The money is just what he collects. The shame is the wall he builds around every victim so that no two of them ever stand in the same room. He does not need to hide. He needs us to hide for him. And for about 3 weeks I did exactly what he needed. I hid. I need to tell you what those 3 weeks actually did to a person, because if you have not been through it, shame is just a word, and it is so much heavier than a word. I could not sleep. I lay awake doing the arithmetic of my father's money, the money that was his 40 years of honest work, running out the door with a smiling stranger, and I did the arithmetic again and again as if this time it might come out different. I could not look at the shop the same way, because the shop was my father, and I had failed my father. I started avoiding people in town, crossing the street, because I was certain that if anyone looked at me closely, they would see it, would see that Earl Reeves' son, the honest one, the one you trust with your car and your life, had been made a complete fool of. I was short with Danny for no reason. I was a ghost in my own house. And the worst of it, the thing I am most ashamed of even now, is that a part of me was angrier at myself than at Wade. Because that is what the shame does. It turns you against yourself. It makes the victim the defendant. Wade Garrett was 3 states away spending my father's money, and I was the one on trial in my own head every single night. That is the crime inside the crime. The money is what he took. The self-blame is what he installed, and it runs on its own long after he is gone, and it runs quietly, which is exactly how he likes it. What broke it was Laura. When I finally told her, she did not yell and she did not say "I told you so," though God knows she could have. She sat with it for a long night, and in the morning she said something I have thought about every day since. She said, "Simon, you are behaving like you did something wrong. You didn't. He did. And a man who did nothing wrong doesn't have anything to hide." She was right, and the moment I let that be true, something changed in me. And it was not rage exactly, though the rage was there. It was more like the feeling I get when a car comes in that everyone else has given up on, and I pop the hood and start, methodically, to figure out what is actually wrong, because there is always a real cause, and a real cause can be traced. And a thing that can be traced can be fixed. I stopped being ashamed, and I started that morning to work the problem. The first thing I did was file a report with the state police properly in writing, and what the investigator told me, gently, was the thing that turned this whole story. He said, "Mr. Reeve, I'll be honest with you. A man like this, working alone across county and state lines, changing names, taking amounts just under the thresholds that trigger certain scrutiny, is very hard for us to move on when it's one victim, one report, one town. He counts on that. What breaks these cases open is pattern. If we could show he's done this before to others and connect it, that's a different animal entirely." Pattern. The word lit up in my head like a trouble light on a dashboard. Wade Garrett was not a lightning strike. He was a pattern, and I fix things by finding patterns. I drove home from that police station not defeated, but for the first time in a month, awake. Because here is what I understood, sitting at my kitchen table that night with a legal pad. Wade Garrett's entire method depended on his victims being isolated, scattered across towns and states, each one silent behind their own wall of shame, never comparing notes. It was the same move he ran on me personally, isolating me from my own wife's good instincts, and it was the move he ran on the world, isolating each victim from all the others. And I realized that the con had a single point of failure, one weakness that ran through the whole thing. And it was this: the isolation only holds if no one connects the dots. If even one person, patient enough and no longer ashamed enough, went and found the others and put them in a room together, the whole structure that made Wade Garrett untouchable would collapse into exactly the pattern the investigators said he needed. I was an honest man with a shop full of tools and a lifetime of tracing problems back to their source. I decided I was going to become the thing Wade Garrett feared most in the world, which was not a victim and not a fist, but a connector. So I started tracing. This is the part that took months, and it was not glamorous. It was the patient, unglamorous work of following a trail one cold link at a time. The same way I chase an electrical fault through a car, wire by wire until I find the break. I had things to work with. I had the fake company name from the partnership agreement. I had the alias Wade Garrett, which I assumed was one of many. I had the Mustang, that beautiful '67 fastback, which had to have come from somewhere and gone somewhere. I had the name of the town he claimed to have come from, and the vague details of the son he cried about by the reservoir. And I had the one thing Wade Garrett could never account for, which was a small-town mechanic with no intention of ever giving up, who had all the time in the world and 110,000 reasons to spend it. The Mustang was the first thread that held. A car like that has a history, a vehicle identification number, a paper trail of ownership. And I know cars. I know how to run a VIN. I know the people in the classic car world because it is a small world, and I have lived in it my whole life. I tracked that Mustang backward, and it had been bought 8 months before Wade came to Ashwood from a private seller 2 states away. A man who remembered the charming buyer well, remembered him under a different name. Wade had told him a story about a development project. He had, that seller mentioned almost as an afterthought, taken money from a mutual acquaintance in that town for a partnership that never materialized. And just like that, standing in my garage with a phone to my ear, I had my second victim. Not me. Someone else. Someone in another state who had also been robbed and had also, I would learn, told almost no one out of shame. The wall had its first crack, and I had made it. And I understood in that moment that I could keep making them one phone call at a time for as long as it took. Over the following months, I built a map. On the wall of my garage office, where my father used to pin work orders, I pinned a map of 4 states, and I put a red thumbtack in every town where I could confirm Wade Garrett, under one name or another, had run his play. I want to tell you about one of those thumbtacks, because she is the reason I kept going on the nights I wanted to quit. Her name was Eleanor, a widow in a town 3 states over, 71 years old, and she had lost nearly everything her husband left her to a charming man who called himself something other than Wade Garrett, but who cried, she told me, about a son he had lost by the water. When I found her, through a small claims filing that had gone nowhere, and I called her and said my piece, that I thought the same man had robbed us both and that she had done nothing wrong and was not alone. There was a silence on the line so long I thought she had hung up. And then Eleanor said, in a very small voice, "I have not told my own children. I let them think I was just bad with money. I was so ashamed." 2 years she had carried it alone, and had let her own kids believe she was foolish rather than admit she had been robbed, because that is how heavy the shame is, heavy enough to choose against your own children rather than set it down. I sat in my garage and I made a promise to Eleanor and to myself that this man was not going to keep doing this, and every time in the following months that the work got cold and tedious and hopeless, I thought about Eleanor's small voice, and I picked the phone back up. There was a temptation, and I will not lie to you about it, to do something else entirely. In the worst weeks I had a fantasy, a detailed one, of simply finding Wade Garrett myself, of driving to wherever he was and settling it the old way with my hands, the way a part of me still believed a wronged man was supposed to. I'm not proud of that fantasy, but I am not going to hide it either, because I think a lot of you have had it. What talked me out of it was not fear, it was my father. Earl Reeve never once in his life solved a problem by losing his temper, and he never once let a dishonest man make him into a dishonest or a violent version of himself. And I understood that if I went and did something with my hands, I would be handing Wade Garrett one final victory. I would be letting him turn Earl Reeve's son into someone Earl Reeve would not recognize. So I put the fantasy down, and I picked the phone back up, because the phone was the thing that actually frightened him, and my hands never would. I found victims the way you find anything if you are patient and unashamed and willing to make the awkward phone call. A classic car forum here, a small claims filing there, a local news item about a vanished developer, a Rotary Club newsletter welcoming a generous newcomer who later disappeared. And every time I found one, I did the thing Wade Garrett had built his whole life to prevent. I called them. I said, "My name is Simon Reeve, I am a mechanic in Ashwood, and I think the same man robbed us both, and you are not alone, and you did nothing wrong." I cannot tell you what it did to people to hear that last part. Grown men wept on the phone. A widow in another state told me I was the first person she had ever admitted it to, 2 years after it happened. Wade Garrett had left a trail of people all carrying the same secret shame, each one certain they were the only fool, and one by one I got to tell them they were not fools and they were not alone, and one by one they said yes, they would help. 14 of them, in the end. 14 people. Wade Garrett thought he had silenced forever, connected by a mechanic with a corkboard and a telephone. I brought all of it to the state investigator, and now it was, as he had said, a different animal entirely. 14 victims, 4 states, a documented pattern of the same fraud under a rotating set of names, the VIN trail on the Mustang, the fake company names, the whole architecture of a career con laid out on paper. That is the kind of case that gets a task force, that crosses the desks of people with real authority, that turns a man who was untouchable as one story into a man who is very touchable indeed as 14. But there was still one problem, and it was a big one. We had the pattern. We did not have Wade Garrett. He was in the wind under a name we did not know, in a town that did not know him yet, already charming his way toward his next $100,000. Building the case was not enough. We had to bring him to it. And that is where the last piece came from. And it came from understanding the one thing about Wade Garrett that never changed, no matter what name he used. His greed and his absolute certainty that his victims stay silent made him predictable. A predictable man can be led. I want to be careful about how I describe this next part, because I did none of it on my own and none of it outside the law, and that matters, both for the truth of the story and because I would not want anyone hearing this to go off and play detective in a way that gets them hurt or wrecks a real case. Everything from here was run by the investigators, with me as a helper who did what he was told. But the idea, the shape of the trap, came from the map on my garage wall, from the thing I understood about Wade Garrett that no case file captured, which was the exact profile of prey he could not resist. Across every town, every thumbtack, the pattern of who he chose was consistent. Someone recently alone, someone with sudden money they did not know how to manage, someone connected to the classic car world he used as his hunting ground, and above all, someone isolated enough that shame would keep them quiet afterward. So we built a mark to that exact specification, a story floated into the precise channels he trawled, and then we did the hardest thing, which was wait and let him find it himself, because a con man trusts nothing he did not discover on his own. It took weeks. And then, one day, the investigator called me and said, in a very flat voice that did not quite hide what was underneath it, he took the bait. He reached out. The meeting's set. I had to sit down when I hung up. Months of phone calls, months of Eleanor's small voice in my head, and the man was walking toward us on his own 2 feet, pulled by the one thing about himself he could never change. Working with the investigators, canned fully under their direction so that nothing we did could ever taint the case, we set a trap baited, with the one thing Wade Garrett could never resist. We created a mark. Not a real person to be endangered, but a carefully constructed opportunity, floated through the exact kind of channels Wade used to find his prey. The classic car networks and the small-town newcomer circles, about a recently widowed woman in a town near Ashwood who had inherited a great deal of money and a collection of classic cars and was looking naively for someone to help her invest and manage it. It was catnip. It was everything Wade Garrett hunted for. And the beauty of it, the justice of it, was that the trap only worked because of exactly the trait that made him a predator. A decent man would have left a grieving widow alone. Wade Garrett could not. He came for her the way he came for me, and the meeting to close the deal was set for the back room of the Ashwood Grange Hall on a Tuesday evening in the fall. He walked in expecting a frightened, wealthy, isolated widow. That is the scene I opened this story with. Wade Garrett came through that door with the sunlit smile I had once trusted with my father's money, and instead of one lonely mark, He found 14 of the people he had robbed sitting in folding chairs, and 2 state investigators by the door, and me in the second row. I had asked for one thing, and the investigators had allowed it, on the condition that I do and say nothing to interfere. I only wanted to be in the room. I wanted to be a face he had to see, because Wade Garrett had looked me in the eye across my own kitchen table and used my dead father to steal my inheritance, and I was not going to hide from him ever again, and I wanted my face to be one of the 14 that killed his smile. I looked around that room before he came in, at the 14 of us in our folding chairs, and I want you to see it too, because it was the most powerful thing I have ever been part of. Eleanor had flown in, 71 years old, sitting in the front row in her good coat with her chin up. There was a young couple who had lost the down payment on their first house. There was a retired teacher, a farmer, a man about my age, who had not told his wife for a year, the way I had not told mine for 3 days. Strangers, all of us from 4 states, connected by nothing but the same smiling face and the same private shame, and now sitting shoulder to shoulder in a Grange hall in Ashwood because a mechanic had refused to stay quiet. Before Wade came in, Eleanor reached over and took my hand, and she did not say anything, and she did not have to. We had all spent so long each believing we were the only fool, and now none of us was alone, and that was true whether Wade Garrett ever walked through that door or not. The arrest was almost beside the point. The room was the victory. The room was the thing he could never have allowed to exist, and we had built it anyway. I will not pretend the arrest was cinematic. It was quiet and procedural and almost anticlimactic, the way real justice usually is. But I will tell you what I felt, because it was not what I expected. I had spent months imagining I would feel triumph or fury, and instead, watching Wade Garrett's face move across that room, recognizing victim after victim, understanding all at once that the isolation he had counted on his entire life had failed, that we had talked to each other, that the one thing he built everything on had broken. What I felt was something quieter and much better than triumph. I felt my father in the room. I felt like Earl Reeves' honest hand had finally reached the man who tried to use it against me. The shame that Wade Garrett manufactured and sold, the wall he built around every person he ever robbed, I had spent months tearing it down one phone call at a time, and now it lay in pieces on the floor of a Grange hall, and he was standing in the rubble of it with nowhere left to hide. The legal process is underway, and I am told, given 14 victims across 4 states and a documented pattern, that it is not the kind of case that ends in anything but a long time behind a locked door, and that meaningful restitution, though it will take years, is likely because men like Wade Garrett usually still have some of the money and a lot of assets. I may get much of my father's $110,000 back. I may not get all of it. And I have made my peace with that, because somewhere in those months of phone calls, I stopped doing this for the money. 14 people got to stop being ashamed. A widow 2 towns over is safe because a trap caught the man who was coming for her. And the next town Wade Garrett would have rolled into, with his silver temples and his sunlit smile, and his story about a son by the water, that town gets to keep its $100,000 and never even know how close it came. That is worth more than my father's money. My father would have said so himself. I still run Reeve Auto on Main Street. The '67 Mustang, by the way, was seized as part of the case, and there is a chance, the investigator tells me with something like a smile, that as a victim I may one day be able to buy it at auction for a fair and honest price. And if that day comes, I'm going to restore it in my father's shop and drive it slow down Main Street with my son in the passenger seat, and it will be the most honest car in the state of anyone's owning. My daughter will be born this spring. Danny still wants to sweep the floor. And I have started saying yes to something I used to be too proud and too private for, which is talking about it out loud to anyone who will listen, telling people exactly how a smart, careful, honest man got taken by a smiling stranger. Because every single time I tell it, I am doing the one thing that actually stops the Wade Garretts of the world. I am tearing down the wall of shame before it can be built. I am connecting the dots out loud in advance. So let me leave you with what my father's money bought, in the end, which was not a development that never existed, but a lesson I am going to give to you for free. The people who rob you with a smile are not counting on your stupidity. They are counting on your shame. They take your money in an afternoon, But the shame is what they use to keep you silent for years, and the silence is what keeps them safe, and the safety is what lets them do it to the next person, and the next. So the single most powerful thing you can do, if it ever happens to you, the thing that turns a victim into the most dangerous person in a con man's world, is to refuse to be ashamed, and to pick up the phone, and to find the others, and to talk. They build their whole lives on the belief that you will stay quiet. Prove them wrong. 14 of us proved Wade Garrett wrong in the back room of a Grange Hall, and I have never in my life been prouder of anything than I am of those 14 folding chairs. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. And tell me honestly, has a smiling stranger ever cost you or someone you love, and did you speak up or did you stay quiet? There is no shame in it here. I read every single comment and I want to hear it. Take care of yourselves, look out for each other, and never ever let anyone make you carry their crime as your shame. I will see you in the next one.